Can you hear me? Of course you can hear me. Hello everyone. All the sort of things that pop up on my computer when I'm doing things. This is the title of the presentation, and I don't like talking to first slides, so I'm going to go to this one, which is me as a futurist, which is one of the 3 careers that I've had in my lifetime. Currently, I'm a PhD student at Stanford and in the Department of Communication, and I'm also a game designer with a company called Natron Baxter Applied Gaming. And previously, I was a futurist, and I worked at a place called the Institute for the Future. And I put futurist in scare quotes because I'm not entirely sure what a futurist does still, even though it was nominally my profession for about 3 years. And at the Institute for the Future, I worked with a woman named Jane McGonigal, and she taught me how to do game design, for which I am eternally grateful. You might have seen her work about games and how they can be powerful tools for changing people's attitudes and behaviors. And I truly believe this about games. I think games are extremely important things that we do not yet know how to use properly. And this presentation is in a way an attempt to try to figure out how we can actually use games in a productive manner to change people's behaviors. I think that they can do certain things like promote stronger community ties and allow us to be better understanding the hopes and fears and desires of other people, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And I'm also very aware that in my life as a PhD student, I spend a lot of time looking at the past. I kind of look at cultural history, and as a futurist, we at the Institute for the Future had this saying that if you want to look to the future, you kind of have to look 2 times as far backwards. So I want to look at like the next generation of creativity, what creativity means in the next 30 years, which means that I have absolute license, Wendy and Claire, to look back about 60 years in order to make this case that I'm going to make. Because history is important. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the contemporary notion of creativity that I think we kind of have right now, and I think I'm trying to grapple with is to figure out if it's actually the kind of creativity we want to be teaching kids. And to do this, I think I'm going to convince you, I know I'm going to convince you, how's that for strong declarative language as a presenter? I will convince you of 4 things: that we're using games in many ways that promote a type of creativity that heralds a return to parallel play, a concept I'll unpack in a little bit. To stop this slide towards parallel play, I think we need to create games that promote community rather than individuality. What we need then is a shift from notions of interactivity to notions of intersubjectivity. And intersubjectivity means paying close attention to creating interpersonal connections through play and not around play. It means creating worlds in which each individual has meaningful, lasting impact on the range of choices and experiences that other people in the space have at their disposal. And Minecraft is a kind of a classic example right now. And I was talking to one of our speakers yesterday about how I was going to start off with Minecraft, and she was saying, it's really interesting because Minecraft is kind of a very difficult subject to talk to right now because it's just everywhere. And it means so many different things to so many different people. But for my purposes, Minecraft is really interesting because it's great. I love playing it. But I'm also wondering what kind of creativity it represents. And I would make the case that the type of creativity that Minecraft shows us is a very individual creativity. It's creativity that is based on recombination and self-direction and immersion in this space, in which I think we think that we're collaborating with other people, but in many ways we're not. We're just participating in this world with other people around us. And we also feel like we're in complete control of the way we move forward, but I'm also going to bring that into question a little bit. And I'm not saying that Minecraft isn't creative, because I think there is a lot to Minecraft that is great, but I think it's important for us to look at things like this and wonder what the origins of that kind of creativity is. So this is the imagination playground. I was talking to David Rockwell, who developed this in Lower Manhattan, and he said that it's designed to encourage children to build and create their own narratives in ever-changing environments. And I think this language is really important, because I think it speaks to a lot of the rhetoric that is being used currently in progressive education for both positive and negative goals. I think we obviously want kids who are able to develop their own pathways in the world, but it's also the kind of language that we see in MOOCs and in apps that are designed in order to sort of give kids this feeling like they're in control of their world, that the only control that they need to have is one that's individually rooted. But I think what this is actually a shift to this notion of parallel play. And I am not a child psychologist or child development, anything, not my field, but learned a little bit about this, and parallel play is, I'm probably describing this to an audience of people who understand it, but I'm going to do it anyway. You're playing in the sense of being in the same space together, but we don't actually treat the thoughts, desires, and intentions of the other players in the space as having any kind of importance. It's really an object-oriented play where we're together but we're not playing in the same world. And what I wonder about Minecraft, and the reason why I'm doing this presentation, is because I wonder if we're creating digital worlds that are in fact bringing us back to this notion of parallel play that we're supposed to outgrow when we're about 4 years old. So to make this case, we're now going to start looking at some pictures of some old white men. So, I think Dewey's a good place to start because any other discussion of education, for me, would rely heavily on Wikipedia. And I don't think that's a very good way to start a presentation. So, I'm going to talk about Dewey, but I also think he has some really interesting things to say about individuals and communities. And in Experience in Education in 1938, he talks about this notion of experience not being just for the individual, but it's something that's rooted in community and is responsive to the community. And there's a desire for self-direction, but it's framed within his understanding of what democracy is. And the democratic process for him is a way for the educator to invite the individual learner to analyze her own experiences within the context of both the subject matter and in dialogue with other learners in the community. So the development of critical thinking in this world is really prized, but it's not just some abstract critical thinking that can operate independent of itself. It's really related to what other people are doing. So now we come back about 60 years, 1952, in this space, not in this space because this is a new building, but literally in the same building that was here before. There were a series of conferences on creativity. And this is great because Andy Clayman yesterday was talking about creativity, sort of this really new notion of creativity as the skill that people really need to have in a contemporary business world. And in fact, this was something that we were struggling with in the 1950s. I hate saying we, I'm Canadian, and somehow I've managed to internalize Americanisms and say we. That really bothers me, but it's totally immaterial to what we're talking about today. I just thought I'd share that neuroses. So in 1950s, there was this, in the early 50s, there was an annual 2-week seminar on creativity. It was led by a man named John Arnold, who we'll talk about in a second. It was attended by business executives from companies like IBM and General Electric, and had presentations by people like Buckminster Fuller and Maslow, and it was all about trying to figure out what creativity meant. So John Arnold, again, another white man, started at MIT, left to go to Stanford and start the design school there, and he had one notion of creativity. And his notion of creativity was a very individual type of creativity. It was one that was rooted in a creative process that was an entirely mental process in which someone combined and recombined, and I'll quote, past experiences, possibly with some distortion, in such a fashion that the new combination, pattern, or reconfiguration better solves some need of mankind. So an example of this that he would give is this, the Harvard Bridge problem. And the Harvard Bridge problem is that spanning the Charles River, linking Boston and Cambridge, there is a bridge which is a hardship to walk over in bad weather. That's great, 1950s language. List the possible ways in which people could be transported across the Harvard Bridge. And I'll concur with this. I did my undergraduate degree down the river at a different liberal arts college in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it's very, very cold when you walk across bridges of the Charles River in the middle of the winter. It's a problem that we need to solve. So what we need to do in Arnold's notion of creativity is first operationalize this statement and say, okay, what are the different variables in this? Getting something from one place to another via a powered vehicle. So you could say, okay, there's the type of vehicle. And the type of vehicle, we have things like a cart, a chair, a sling, a bed. The second is the media in which this vehicle operates. So we have air, water, oil. The third is the power source, so we could have things like steam, electric motor. And then he says, okay, what we want to do is just list every possible thing that we can think of in each of these criteria, and then just recombine them. And what we'll do is we'll come up with these really new, interesting ideas, like a chair that glides on water and is powered by a magnetic field. And that is a creative act for Arnold. This is the kind of essence of his notion of creativity. It's a listing and a systematic recombination, and the group only comes in at the level of adding to the list. And one thing that's really great about this is, what's interesting about this, I'm not sure if it's great, so he schematizes creativity. He says it can be totally blacked out into this notion of, we have analytical at the top, then we have judicial, and then we have creative. And I think you're all probably familiar with this notion of that he really prized in rational creativity, which is omphaloskepsis, which is, of course, contemplation of one's own navel as an aid to meditation. So he literally believed in navel gazing as kind of a creative act, which I think is excellent, because that means I'm super creative. There's a second type of creativity, though. This guy named William J.J. Gordon, had this notion of operational creativity. And operational creativity, I'll note that William Gordon was a Harvard psychologist. Operational creativity was something quite different than what Arnold was proposing. Operational creativity was a group activity rather than an individual activity. The group operated as an organic unit rather than being a competitive unit where people were trying to achieve the best outcome. And whereas brainstorming, very much like it is today, is supposed to be something where you just build on other people's ideas in a very positive manner, operational creativity recognizes that people aren't positive all the time. In fact, it's important that we have negative emotions. This is something that, if you know any of Jane's work, it's kind of heresy for one of her students to be saying this, but negativity and critical thinking was important in this creative process, because it was something that was embedded in human nature, and so we had to take it fully into account. And instead of being goal-oriented, it was something that was really important in terms of the means. It was about inculcating this notion of creativity as an ongoing process that was rooted fundamentally in group. And for Gordon, the more you had a group climate, the more creative individuals would be. And the argument I'm going to make for the rest of this presentation is that I think what we've done in building the games that we've been building has been spending a lot more time on the Arnold type of creativity and not enough time on the Gordon type of creativity. And this is not to say that the Arnold type of creativity isn't useful. In fact, the Arnold creativity is an extremely useful thing to have. But I think we also need to think about what creativity means when it's rooted in an intersubjective notion, this notion of paying attention to what other people want and desire, and working within those constraints. So I'll say that Harvard obviously was right. Of course, that's not absolutely true, but it's, I'm standing here at MIT making this lecture, and I'd be remiss if I didn't take a jab at them in some way. But in the 1950s, we actually saw this we witnessed this really interesting moment in American arts and community that was struggling with the notion of individual and community and how these two things related to one another. And I think when we start to look back a little bit about what intersubjectivity meant in the 1950s, we can start to see some principles that we might want to think about when we're designing interactive spaces or intersubjective spaces going forward. Bebop jazz, as an example, is a really good notion of this. It's this moment in American history where across the arts, whether in abstract expressionism or beat poetry or theater, spontaneity is really key. And this spontaneity isn't just sort of some absolute off-the-wall spontaneity that has no logic to it. It was about paying attention to what other people were doing and then being spontaneous within those constraints. So this is a creativity that is extremely conversational, and you see this in bebop jazz. You can't not pay attention to the other people playing, because then you won't be making any sense. Your creativity will just be completely unrooted. So this is play that is used to ground creativity, and it's a creativity that is also grounded in a community that's formed through this play. It's about paying attention to others in an intersubjective way. So this is also seen in some stuff that's worked on by people who are working in community building. And this is a piece of play sculpture, one of many that this man, Joseph Brown, produced. He was I think he was at the School of Architecture and Department of Physical Education at Princeton, I believe. And his notion was a very similar idea, which was our actions don't make sense when we don't pay attention to the other people who are around us. What I'm going to do is build a bunch of these sort of very much network almost play structures, wherein you can see this little guy is walking along this string, and his actions are related intimately to the actions that other people are making in the play space. His pathway, his literal pathway through this space, can only be made with respect to the other people who are on this structure. So this is really important because it means that in play, through the play, there's a notion of community being built. It's not around the play. It's not this sort of wrapper that says, well, we've had this common experience and now we talk about it. The common experience itself is the core for this new notion of community that was being built. And I think it's really important also, and this is the last bit in the historical aspect, that we look at this creativity and this recreation, in fact, as something that wasn't just for children at this moment. And this is the stuff that I'm looking at most right now in my own research, which is that actually in the 1950s there was this moment where recreation and play was actually seen as the foundation for all sorts of communities, and not just communities of children, but the parents and the grandparents and all the people who were coming back from World War II and living in new communities that were spread out all across the United States without any kind of center core. And play was seen as the way, play in the guise of recreation, as a way to bring together these new communities. I mean, this is fantastic. Recreation for community living. And my larger project, and I won't talk about it here, is rethinking this notion of play as something that is new, or games rather as something that is new, but rather something that's rooted in what was a fantastic moment in the mid-50s of recreation as something that could really be a unifying force in contemporary society. So this was spearheaded by the National Recreation Association, which was the Playground Association of America before that. Really fascinating stuff. Could talk about it for years. But the important thing is this complicated map of LA. And what you see is literally here a map of how Los Angeles is organized with respect to play. And these are all neighborhood, and a lot of these places are actually recreation centers that have been developed either adjacent to or in combination with schools. So there's a real combination here between recreation and education being this unifying force. But this is literally what communities were supposed to look like in Los Angeles in the mid-century. We were supposed to have these new communities formed because of and through the type of play that was being embodied in recreation centers and in playgrounds all across the country. So now I'm going to jump really far forward in time. This is work that's being done in my department at Stanford by a professor named Jeremy Bailenson. Jeremy Bailenson has the best virtual reality lab in the country. And he does a lot of research into presence. And this is where it starts to get really interesting because we start to think about, well, what happens when our notion of community is not physical spaces like this, but is actually virtual spaces that we're spending more and more time in? What happens when we're looking at community as something that is mediated through Minecraft and not through a playground or a school? So there are three types of presence in virtual reality. There's physical presence, so how much do I feel like the tree that I'm cutting down in the virtual world is an actual tree? There's social presence, which is how much do I feel like the other people in the environment are actually people? And this is an important one because it actually turns out that we don't do a very good job of distinguishing between, there are two types, an agent and an avatar. An agent is a human-looking thing that is controlled by a computer. An avatar is a human-looking thing that is controlled by a person. We have a really hard time distinguishing between an agent and an avatar, which I think is significant, right? Because of course we're creating worlds in which there's parallel play because we're not able to distinguish between what a person is and what an object is. So we start to treat objects like they're humans, or humans like they're objects. It creates a very, very interesting and difficult situation for us to deal with when we're creating virtual worlds. And the third thing is the self-presence. And this is kind of orthogonal a little bit, but worthwhile paying attention to, which is that the self-presence is how much do I feel like the avatar in the game is actually a representation of me. And what Jeremy has found out across a whole bunch of different studies is, in fact, there are profound effects that occur when you inhabit an avatar and then come back to the real world. So here, if I'm cutting down a tree, I come back to the real world, and after going through this process of becoming more environmentally aware, I exhibit behaviors that are much more environmentally aware in the real world. I use less paper when I'm mopping things up. Similarly, if I have an avatar that is taller than I usually am in the real world, I start negotiating both in the real world as if I'm taller, and then when I come back, there's a persistent effect for a while that I will negotiate as a taller person. It's called the Proteus effect, and there's a bunch of really interesting papers on that. But the important thing here is, what we really need to think about is how we can create worlds where we're treating people as real people, because that's what they are, and not people as objects, which is, I think, what we've done in games till now. And so we want to think about, are we creating worlds that really advance Arnold's type of creativity, or are we creating ones like Gordon's? Because I think Gordon's provides a pathway for us to be more grounded in this notion of intersubjectivity. And I'm not saying that I have the solution. So this is a game that I've been working on with a Peruvian economist named Hernando de Soto, and it's supposed to teach people these fundamental economic principles that de Soto thinks are key to learning about how to be an entrepreneur in the modern world. And I think it's a great game, because I designed it. But beyond that, I bring it up because I'm going to point to some examples now that sort of say, well, who's doing this well? And I don't want to say that I have the answers, because I don't. I struggle with this. I create games that ultimately, I think, treat people as if they're inputs into stimulus and not intersubjective, creating intersubjective relationships. But I think that by doing this, we can bring an awareness to this need to reroute and reclaim creativity in this other way. Because I think this can't be the only practice that kids get in doing community. Because if this is the only practice that kids get in doing community, I worry for what creativity looks like in the future. I worry that it's something that's completely individual and it's not taking into account the kind of thing that makes bebop so amazing. So here's a game that I think is, like Minecraft, pointed to as an example of creativity. LittleBigPlanet for PlayStation lets you choose all these different elements and create these new maps and then sort of put them onto a marketplace and people can download them and play them themselves. And I wonder what type of creativity this is. And I would argue that it's actually a diminished form of creativity. It's the Arnold form of creativity, not the Gordon type. Because it doesn't force us to really attend to and respond to the other, except for in some kind of market logic where creativity becomes associated with the number of downloads that I can get. And I just play in this world that someone else has provided for me. Rock Band is super interesting for me too, because in a lot of ways, Rock Band does, or feels like it does, what I'm asking for. But if we sort of dig a little deeper, I don't think people are really being connected through the music here. Because I don't think we're creating community through the game, but rather around the game. It really doesn't matter if the person beside me is screwing up in the game, because ultimately, until the game ends, I don't really feel the effects of it. Yeah, there's sort of this notion that the music distorts a little bit, but in fact, I'm not paying attention to them. I'm paying attention to my ability to hit these different targets And afterward, people feel really great. I love Rock Band. I love all of these games. I've played them all for many more hours than I would be comfortable to admit. But I think because we can comfortably ignore what the other people are doing, there's a hint of that intersubjectivity, but I'm not sure it's there. Similarly with World of Warcraft, and I bring this up because Jane talks a lot about World of Warcraft sort of being this new form of collaboration. And to some degree, I think it's true. But I also wonder how deeply that collaboration resides, right? Are we in fact collaborating with other people in the way that Gordon would have wanted, treating their hopes and fears and desires as being important? Or are our actions sort of abstracted from this notion of other people? Do they actually impact the pathways that other people can have in the world and bring these people closer together? Or I guess a good way to phrase this is this intersubjective or merely interactive? And Journey, in a lot of ways, is kind of the game that comes closest to this, but also I think is frustratingly far from being able to implement this notion of intersubjectivity. Journey is a game developed by that game company, and its developers have said that they sought to evoke in the player a sense of smallness and wonder, and to forge an emotional connection between the player and anonymous players that they meet along the way. So you're in this world, playing as an avatar, and you stumble upon these other people. But they can't communicate with each other in any meaningful way. And also, they can't hinder each other. Or they can't really affect each other's pathways at all in any way that really takes into account what it's like to be with a person in real life. Because people are messy, and people create all sorts of problems for each other. It can be intended or unintended consequences, but that's the way that the world works. And when they say they're trying to create a sense of companionship, I wonder, can you really call it companionship if you're not accepting people's flaws? If you're not brought into awareness of the fact that other people make things more difficult for you, not because they're malicious perhaps, but because that's just the way that we are in the world. We create ripples, and other people live in those ripples. And we have to be aware of other people's ripples and the effect that we create, because then we start to be able to do things that are much more creative. So, in conclusion, I want to return to playgrounds. And this playground is, I think, one of the better examples of the type of intersubjectivity that I think we need to reappropriate. And it's created by a Berlin architecture firm called Annabau, and it's in Wiesbaden. I don't say German words. And it's part of this effort to revitalize this downtown core of this city. And you can see that this is basically the same kind of structure that was being built in 1952. These kids move throughout this playground and have their actions tangibly interact with the kinds of things that other kids in the playground can do. And I think it's also interesting because it's right in the center of town. So, although I haven't spent much time talking about the fact that this is something that shouldn't just be for kids, I think it's really important to think about how do kids interact with people that are older than them, and how do people interact with kids? Because by, I think, secluding that notion, we don't really start to develop a full range of what community is. So the take-home here is, what I really think we need to do is take some small steps like this, which I don't think is perfect, but I think is a really good example of readopting Gordon's type of creativity. It's one that promotes intersubjectivity, community, and creativity through play. Thank you.
Any questions? Number one, what does he do? But
yeah, what do I do?
But any questions?
I read a lot of books.
No, you're too smart for it. Oh, I'm sorry, Scott. Right.
I was willing to start. So you invented something and you said you didn't quite get there yet. Can you say a little bit, articulate about what issues you were struggling with in your own game design?
So, yeah, that's a great question. So this is the game. It's an iPad game. I think one of the things that's really difficult is that I don't know that iPads can do what I'm asking for. I think Minecraft moves in the right direction, But iPads fundamentally make it extremely difficult to communicate with other people in any meaningful way. I don't think you can do it in a way, I don't think you can have this type of creativity in a place where everything is reduced to just movement of things on a board or movement of things on a screen. Because then you're just interacting with some like abstracted notion of a person rather than interacting with them in a meaningful way. So, I mean, we tried to do things like have people communicate through chat or through voice or whatever, and it's just a proxy that's not quite there. And I'm not sure if it's a technology thing or if it's a first principles design thing where you need to just go back and think, okay, if this is the core of what we want to create, let's create an experience around that, rather than saying we want to create something that teaches a certain content and develop a game through that. Which is, I think, what we did. We created a game that was and this is, I mean, I think it's a valuable, so I think we still need to have games like this. But I think we also need to have them with games like the other ones.
It's really exciting to hear you talk about this. I think it's great, the idea of collaboration and community. I think all of us in this room, and I can say we because I'm from California, we're working with young kids. Right, so that brings a unique set of like privacy issues and safety issues, and we're talking about collaboration. And you know, COPA this year is getting a lot more like strict. Can you talk a bit about that and any advice you'd give for people who want to pursue, you know, creating games like this, but also want to, you know, be COPA compliant and keep kids safe?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'll start it by saying, fundamentally, I don't know. I mean, one of the things about trying to have a provocative approach to this is that there are all sorts of issues that need to be worked out. I will say, though, that things like playgrounds as open community spaces, this is why I think looking at public recreation and looking at kind of the ways that we've done this in non-digital spaces gives us a really good idea about how we can do this in digital spaces. Because places like this struggle with privacy issues too, but they struggle with them in a very different way. They struggle with them in a way that it presupposes that there will be adults kind of around helping moderate things. So the only advice that I can really give without being totally speculative, which is totally fine, I mean, I love being speculative, is to look to places like this and say, well, how did they solve the problems of privacy in a public space where people are materially visible? And then what can we use that? How can we sort of model our behaviors around that? I know that's sort of a wishy-washy answer, but I don't have a better one.
Next question.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I love you bringing the playground aspect into your conversation about gameplay. What specific about this playground do you feel exhibits the kind of creativity you're talking about? And the second part is, with your work with game design on screen and in digital mode, what do you see as a bridge between these two environments?
Okay, great question, thank you. With this playground, I think, so the core of the argument that I think I'm trying to make is that in order to have that second type of creativity, we need to create an intersubjectivity and a dialogue that is seen in things like bebop jazz. So this kind of space, I think, embodies that notion of intersubjectivity. And so what I guess I'm saying is that that type of creativity only comes about if we can make people realize that they are enmeshed in communities. And when we're enmeshed in communities, we start to do things that are much more, I think there's not sort of a linear, like we then become more creative, but I think it creates the conditions under which we can start thinking about how does my creativity impact other people. So the thing here is the movement in the space is literally, I mean, there's this, it's a very tangible thing when you're actually on the play space, that when you're crawling around, the ropes really start to pull the other people. So you have to kind of be in dialogue with other people, and if you're trying to make one pathway, the other person's sort of falling off, they're going to, you know, yell at you and say, "What are you doing? I want to create a pathway through this space too. Like, we both have to live on this play structure. This is not just you moving uninhibited through the world. The second thing I'll say with respect to the digital is that this is why games like Journey and Minecraft are really interesting to me. Because in some ways, and we had this great conversation at dinner last night about whether or not in Minecraft we are actively, there are times in Minecraft where you actually do treat other people like people. But it unfortunately comes about usually when someone screws up something that you've been working on, right? So you're like building a house or something, and then someone comes along and like floods it or drops a thing of lava in it, and then you get really mad at that person. So unfortunately, the emotions that are associated with intersubjectivity right now are when people really screw up your world. But I think we can then take that and say, well, okay, well, what's interesting about that? Well, it's a very strong emotional state where someone does impact something that I've been working on. So what we want to do is create more opportunities for other people to help me work on the things that I want to achieve and have us create shared goals or shared outcomes that we think would be desirable. And sort of bring it away from this negative emotion, association with negative emotion.
I'm confused.
Okay.
Because you've been talking a great deal about intersubjectivity, not the easiest word to say in the universe.
Sorry, I missed that.
And the idea of creating communities, but within a virtual setting. Because in fact, what half of us are doing right now, which is being on our iPads, kind of interrupts any recognition of other people. So I guess the question is, why try to do it? Why not get people to, take something that they found on their iPad and go to the playground and be on the groovy rope activity, which I can't wait to try, but I'm too big and old, or talk to each other in real life, or any of the other options for actually recognizing the presence of another person.
So that's actually a great question, because it's something that I struggle with too, which is that I think this is great. I would love to live in a world where this is where people sort of want to go for community. But I think, as you can see, digital mediation is just the way that people interact. And I think it's a diminished form of interactivity is the argument that I'm making. And so I would love also to find ways to bring people out of the digital world. I myself, I'm just like, I look at screens probably for 3/4 of my waking hours, and it's terrible. But I also think that first, it's just sort of I don't think there are any kind of facts that are unassailable, but I think right now there's a lot of momentum towards trying to create more and more virtual environments in which kids can learn certain types of skills. I think Minecraft is really interesting because Minecraft wasn't designed as an educational tool, right? Minecraft was designed by a kind of weird Swedish guy who had this great idea that has been picked up and now used like for any number of things. So I think in making the sort of claim that I'm making, which is that we need to start having this sort of creativity, I'm saying, well, these spaces are going to be built. Whether we like it or not, they're going to be built. And we need to start thinking about what goes into building them in a way that doesn't just end up with this one type of individual notion of creativity. But if we could like get people to go outside and play in playgrounds and in recreation, I spend all my time looking at buildings from the 1950s. And I don't think they had all the solutions. It was all old white guys. That's a problem. It's a problem that they're not bringing anyone else into the discussion. But I think they had some interesting ideas about these notions of creativity that have, they change throughout the years, but it's just sort of this core element of individual and community that I think we're struggling with.
All right, I think that's it, but
All right.
you're going to be at
Yeah, I'll be
lunch.
around.
Yeah, so.
Thank you very
any more
much.
questions?